It's July 23rd, 1999, and a Boeing 747 carrying 517 people is nosediving just 1,000 feet from the ground. One of its passengers has just committed murder. Is he about to be responsible for the death of hundreds more? Hello and welcome to the Little Shop of Crime, curators and purveyors of all things macabre and mysterious. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is the 8th video I've recorded now, but at the time of filming I haven't actually uploaded any of them yet, so I don't even know if anyone's going to be watching these or subscribing. But one of the things I'm really enjoying is exploring the world as I research these cases. But today is something a little different, because the crime itself takes place not in a dark corner of some exotic land, but on board a packed jumbo jet. But first, some quick shopkeeping. My name is Steve and I offer fascinating true crime cases every week, usually solved but occasionally mysterious. So if that sounds like your thing, please hit that subscribe button now. And if you want to get in touch, check the description below. Okay, let's investigate. Please fasten your seatbelt and make sure your seat back and folding tray are in their full upright position. This is Murder at 36,000 feet. Yuji Nishizawa. Japan. What's it known for? Ninja and geisha, sushi and Mount Fuji, bullet trains and Buddhist shrines and cherry blossoms. Origami, tiny hotels, manga, and sumo, and robots, and toilets from the distant future, and more vending machines than grains of rice that sell just about anything. Made up of an almost unbelievable 6,852 islands, Japan is widely considered to be one of the safest, most technologically advanced countries on Earth. It's also one of the most densely populated and urbanised, and since 3/4 of its land is mountainous, its 125.5 million residents are funneled into narrow coastal regions. And today's story begins in its capital city, Tokyo. An economic powerhouse, a sprawling metropolis, a home to a whopping 14.4 million people, Tokyo is the most populous metropolitan area in the world, and the futuristic city is served by 2 major airports, one of which being Haneda Airport. Located in the densely populated Ota City in the heart of Tokyo, Haneda Airport is one of the busiest airports on Earth. And at 11 AM on a hot and humid morning on the 23rd of July 1999, All Nippon Airways Flight 61 was on the tarmac, ready to depart. The Boeing 747-481D for the geeks was carrying 14 crew members and 503 passengers, including 14 children. Flight 61 was bound for New Chitose Airport near Sapporo on the northern island of Hokkaido. But this particular flight wouldn't make it there. One of the 503 passengers was Yuji Nishizawa. He was born on September 8, 1970 in Tokyo. A highly intelligent man, 28-year-old Yuji had graduated from the elite Hitotsubashi University, but was at this point unemployed, living in the Edogawa district of Tokyo. Yuji was described as a loner. He struggled to form new relationships and friendships and was an ardent plane enthusiast, spending a great deal of his free time playing on flight sims. Flight 61 took off smoothly and began climbing to cruising altitude, but just a few minutes into the ascent, an agitated Yuji got out of his seat and removed a 20cm or 8-inch knife from his bag. He climbed the stairs to the upper deck of the plane where the cockpit is located, and there he pressed the knife into the back of a flight attendant and said, "If you don't want to die, open the cockpit." Once inside, he ordered 34-year-old First Officer Kazuyuki Koga to leave. Since most hijackings at the time didn't end in fatalities, the co-pilot decided to listen to his demands, and so after a brief struggle he exited the cockpit, leaving Yuji alone with the captain, 51-year-old Naoyuki Nagashima. Around 25 minutes into the flight, Nagashima managed to notify air traffic control about the hijacking, but Yuji ordered him to divert the plane to the US military's Yokota Air Base in western Tokyo. The military airbase gave clearance for the landing and started to make preparations, but the captain, Nagashima, refused to divert, and so Yuji stabbed him repeatedly in the neck and shoulder before taking full control of the massive aircraft in an attempt to steer it there himself. To the passengers at this point, something was quite clearly drastically wrong. During the struggles, an audible commotion came from the cockpit, the sound of raised and threatening shouts, and the plane began to sway erratically. And to mask the clear sound of fighting coming from the cockpit, Flight 61's crew started showing the popular Pokemon cartoons, in order to prevent the 14 children on board from panicking. But 30 minutes later, the tension would turn into every passenger's worst nightmare. The plane quite suddenly entered a steep dive. It fell from a cruising altitude of 36,000 feet down to 980 feet, or just 300 meters. And at this point, First Officer Koga and his crew decided they had to at least attempt to regain control of the aircraft. Koga fought Yuji Nishizawa for a second time, but this time he managed to subdue him, and with the help of his crewmates he tied Yuji up with neckties and belts from nearby passengers. And so just after midday, about an hour after takeoff, co-pilot Koga took control of the aircraft. At which point he told air traffic control back at Haneda Airport, "It's an emergency, the captain was stabbed, prepare an ambulance." One hour and 20 minutes after takeoff, Flight 61 landed back at Tokyo Haneda Airport. 502 passengers and 13 crew left the plane uninjured. Soon after, a doctor boarded the plane and confirmed the death of pilot Nagashima of Yokohama. He'd bled to death. And Yuji Nishizawa was taken into custody charged with murder, at which point he simply told police, "I wanted to soar through the air." A number of Flight 61's passengers were questioned immediately. 60-year-old Yoshiko Kawase, who sat in the row opposite from Yuji, said that he seemed fidgety and tense, and that his hair was wild, and he was wearing these dirty white cotton gloves which stood out at the time because it was a humid 91-degree day. Despite the tension and fear throughout the ordeal, apparently the passengers remained remarkably calm throughout, and for the most part they just hunkered down so as not to be singled out by Yuji and his 20cm knife. One man, 42-year-old Yosuhiro Fukuda, said that he'd never seen the ground so close up during a flight, and they really thought it was it. But all of the passengers who provided comment mentioned that the crew had performed incredibly, in terms of maintaining calm and professionalism throughout, especially when dealing with the kids. This was Japan's first deadly hijacking in 30 years, and the country wanted answers. Speaking at the Tokyo Parliament building, Prime Minister Kaizo Obuchi said, "It is extremely unfortunate that such an incident occurred. I can only express my deep regret. We have to examine how the hijacker could enter the cockpit and what measures were then taken." Obuchi also demanded a full investigation take place into how Yuji Nishizawa managed to smuggle a 20cm knife onto the aircraft, and it turned out he'd been planning the event for quite some time, and it wasn't exactly a well-guarded secret. Being an avid aircraft enthusiast, Nishizawa spent a lot of time inside Haneda Airport. Whilst there, he spotted a major security flaw. Yuji noticed that after a flight, during checked baggage claim, instead of leaving the airport the normal way, a passenger could collect their bag and instead walk straight into the departures lounge. Since they were still what an airport classes as airside, they'd have no security to pass through, and were therefore able to bring their bags on board a second flight. Yuji put his method into practice and tested his theory out on a round-trip flight to Kumamoto. What's tragic is the events of Flight 61 could easily have been prevented. On June 19th, 1999, a month before, Yuji sent an email to Mainichi Shimbun newspaper titled "Problems of Current Security Check Conditions at the Haneda Big Bird." In the email, he described in detail the lax security systems at the airport, and he also described how he was confident that he'd be able to bring a weapon on board an aircraft. He sent the same email to Haneda Airport Police, the Civil Aviation Bureau, and the Transport Ministry, as well as 3 airlines, including All Nippon Airways, who operated Flight 61, and he even applied for a job working for airport security. 1 phone call from the airport. That's all Yuji received in response to all of his messages. He was clearly angered by this, and so that's when he decided to exploit the flaw himself, and he began to hatch his plan. And this is how he did it. Yuji checked in for a Japan Airlines flight from Tokyo to Osaka with the knife in his checked luggage. He also checked himself onto Flight 61. A few hours later, he was back at Haneda Airport in baggage reclaim, where he collected his bag, and just as he described, he was able to make his way straight into the departures lounge, carrying his bag and the knife on board Flight 61 as carry-on luggage. It was that simple. Despite his apparent anger at being ignored, it wasn't the motive Yuji gave to investigators. During questioning, he explained that his motive was simply that he wanted to fly a real plane. His plan was to fly under the Rainbow Bridge in Tokyo. Adding to the frustrating lack of response that could have prevented this tragedy, Yuji actually planned on carrying out the hijacking the day before. He told his parents and his psychiatrist that he was travelling alone to Hokkaido, which raised suspicions. His parents checked his bags and discovered multiple flight tickets, along with the knife. But despite the bright red flags and deafening alarm bells this should have raised, it only managed to delay him by a day. And to make sure he wasn't hampered again, he purchased multiple flight tickets for the following day, along with Flight 61. Extensive psychiatric evaluations were performed on Yuji Nishizawa to determine his culpability. The first, requested by his defence, diagnosed him as having Asperger's syndrome, an autism spectrum disorder. A second, more extensive evaluation was carried out, this time at the prosecution's request. This examination was conducted by Hideo Hosaki, a professor emeritus at Keio University, taking 6 months in total. He concluded that Yuji was under significant influence of antidepressant drugs and was in a state of diminished culpability at the time of the crime. His ability to distinguish right from wrong was weakened significantly at the time of the crime, but I cannot say he lost it completely. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Yuji had jumped off a Tokyo building in a failed suicide attempt. He was, at the time of the incident, being treated for chronic depression and had taken a large dose of antidepressant medication before the episode. But ultimately, it was down to a judge to determine his accountability. Under Japanese law at the time, a hijacking resulting in a fatality carried a possible death sentence. Yuji accepted full responsibility for his actions. He apologised for the death of pilot Naoyuki Nagashima and pled guilty, even saying there was nothing wrong with the hijacking and murder charges brought against him. He stated that he did not care if he was sentenced to death for the crimes. Yuji's state of mind was the central argument to this trial. Due to the meticulous planning, prosecutors argued that it was premeditated and well thought out. However, they didn't call for him to be put to death, demanding a life sentence instead. His defence team admitted the allegations, but they pleaded not guilty, asking for clemency by reason of insanity. And on March 23, 2005, almost 6 years after the incident, Yuji Nishizawa was found guilty at Tokyo District Court. but was also determined to be of unsound mind, so he was held only partly responsible for his actions, and the presiding judge Hisaharu Yasui sentenced him to life imprisonment. On handing down the ruling, Yasui said, "The hijacking incident was a dangerous and vicious crime unprecedented in Japanese crime history and tremendously damaged public trust in the safe operation of aircraft. The defendant bears grave responsibility for the crime, and it would be inevitable to give him capital punishment. However, the court has decided to commute the sentence as he had diminished responsibility. The defendant impulsively came up with murderous intent and killed the pilot after suffering intense anxiety and frustration that he would not be able to carry out his plan to maneuver the plane as the pilot did not leave the cockpit." Predictably, the flaws within Haneda Airport, as well as other airports throughout Japan, were revised and eliminated following the incidents of Flight 61. Too little too late for its captain though, in an event that could so easily have been prevented if the warning signs had been heeded. Captain Nagashima's family sued All Nippon Airways, the Japanese state, and Yuji Nishizawa's family following his death. An undisclosed settlement was reached on December 21, 2007. Flight 61 still operates to this day, but with a Boeing 787 since the plane in this incident was retired in 2014. On any given moment, there are, on average, around 10,000 planes in the air. It really is one of the safest ways to travel. And thankfully, hijackings are incredibly rare nowadays, particularly since the reforms that followed the 9/11 hijackings. It's just a shame that it usually takes a tragedy for these reforms to happen in the first place. And although this case is tragic, it could have been a whole lot worse. But it is nonetheless frustrating just how many warnings had to be ignored for it to take place at all. Thanks so much for watching this video with me today. If you enjoyed it or learned anything, please give it a quick like and let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's case. Goodbye.